Wyoming Territory, early spring of 1879. The wind carried grit across the dry plains as the wagon rolled into Red Bluff with chains rattling louder than the wheels. They paraded her through town like a warning. Grace Fallon walked barefoot, wrists bound in iron, dress torn at the hem, her dark hair tangled from the journey. Her eyes, though, stayed steady. Not wild, not broken, just quiet and watching, like she had already seen the worst and was still standing. Behind her, two men from the territorial marshal's office rode horseback. They called her a thief, a runaway, a liar. Said she was more dangerous than she looked. They said she belonged in chains. Holt Sutton leaned against the post outside the general store, hat tipped low, arms crossed. He had not meant to stop in Red Bluff that day, just needed oats for his horse and a fresh spool of thread. But the moment he saw her, the world narrowed. She did not flinch when a boy threw a rock, did not beg when the preacher's wife whispered a prayer like she was already damned. She just kept walking, slow and proud, eyes fixed on something far beyond the jail at the end of the street. Holt pushed off the post and followed. By dusk, word had spread. They claimed Grace Fallon had stolen from the Livingston family over in Cheyenne, took off with a satchel of gold and a horse that was not hers. The Livingstons wanted her tried and hung, but none of it sat right with Holt. He asked around, found out she had worked for the Livingstons as a housemaid for over a year, that she had two children, both gone now. One died of fever last winter. The other, a girl named Kira, just 4, had been sent off to an orphanage 2 towns over when Grace was arrested. They said she tried to run with the child, the barkeep muttered. They caught her before she reached the county line. That night, Holt could not sleep. He stared at the ceiling of the boarding house, jaw tight, thinking about the set of her shoulders, the bruises on her arms, the way she had not looked away when their eyes met across the street. By morning, he was saddling his horse. The jail was made of stone, with a locked iron door and a single barred window. He waited until the sheriff rode out with his deputies to investigate a cattle rustling report. Grace sat in the back cell, wrists still bound, the skin there raw. "You got a death wish?" she asked when he stepped through the door. "No," Holt said, "but I think you might." She stared at him, not moving. "You here to return me to the fire or pull me from it?" "I am here," Holt said, drawing the key from his coat pocket, "because I do not think you belong in those chains." Her breath caught, but she did not move. "I stole the key," he said, "so you do not have to steal your life back alone." He fit the key into the lock. The cuffs clattered to the floor. Grace's hands shook as she rubbed her wrists. She blinked fast, lips pressed tight like she was holding something in. Then she looked up at him. "Why?" she asked. "Because I believe you," Holt said, "and because you deserve better than what they gave you." She stood. "Then let us go." They rode out under cloud cover, cutting south through the low hills and dry brush. Holt knew the back trails, the ones no lawman would think to check. Grace rode behind him on his dun mare, arms wrapped loosely around his waist. She did not speak much, but when she did, it was careful, steady. By the third night, they made camp near a creek. Holt built the fire while Grace sat close, warming her hands. "My daughter," she said quietly, "Kira, she is all I have left." "We will find her," Holt said. Grace watched the flames. "She is too young to remember me. 4 years old. I do not know if she will even know my face." "She will," he said. "A child remembers love." She looked at him then, really looked. "You speak like a man who has known loss." "I buried a brother," Holt said, poking at the fire, "and a mother who never stopped grieving him. I know what it means to lose and still keep going." Grace nodded, silent again. Later, as they lay under the stars, their bedrolls set apart by a few feet, Holt heard her whisper. "They said I belonged in chains, that I was nothing. But when I held Kira in my arms, I was more than I ever thought I could be." He turned toward her. "You still are." The next morning, they reached Lorry Fork, a quiet town tucked between 2 ridges. Holt knew a woman there, a midwife who sometimes took in children the orphanage turned away. Her name was Mabel, and when she saw Grace, her mouth fell open. "They said you were dead." "Not yet," Grace said. Mabel led them inside. In the back room, a little girl with dark curls sat on a rug, clutching a wooden doll. "Kira," Grace breathed. The girl turned. Grace dropped to her knees. "Baby, it is me." Kira stared for a moment. Then her face lit up. "Mama!" She ran. Grace caught her and held her tight. tears pouring silently down her face as she buried her nose in her daughter's hair. Holt stepped back, giving them space. His chest ached watching them. That kind of love, it was not loud. It was not showy. It was carved into bone. That night, they stayed in Mabel's spare room. Kira nestled between them on the floor as Grace tucked her in with a soft blanket. When the little girl was asleep, Grace turned to Holt. "I owe you everything," she said. "No," he said. "You owe me nothing." Grace reached for his hand. "I have not trusted a man since the day my husband left us with nothing but a broken wagon and a sick child. But you saw me." "I did," Holt said, his voice low. "And I keep seeing you. Every time I close my eyes." She leaned in. He did not move. Her lips brushed his. It was soft, careful, like a question. He answered by pulling her close. She rested her forehead against his. "I do not know what comes next." "I do," he said. "You and Kira come with me." Grace stared at him. "You mean that?" "I do," Holt said. "They said you belonged in chains. But I say, you belong in my arms." Her eyes filled again, but this time there was no pain in them, only light. And when she kissed him again, it was not like a question. It was a promise. The wind had shifted by morning, carrying the sharp scent of thawing earth and pine as Holt stacked dried biscuits and salted venison into a rucksack. Mabel's porch creaked behind him, and when he turned, Grace stood there with Kira leaning sleep-heavy against her shoulder. "She couldn't sleep," Grace said, voice hushed. "Too much new in her dreams, I think." Holt stepped down and opened the cabin door for them both. "You want to stay here a while? Mabel's got room. No one would look for you this far out. Not for a good while." Grace shook her head. "I won't let her grow up in hiding. I want her to know light, not just shadows. She deserves to walk a road without fear." He nodded once. "Then we'll make a new road." Inside, the girl stirred. She blinked slowly at Holt, then tucked her face against her mother's neck. Grace set her down gently on the cot, smoothing the blanket over her. "She doesn't speak much when she's tired," she said, "but she listens to everything." "You're teaching her strength just by standing," Holt said. Grace glanced over her shoulder. "You always talk like that. Only when I mean it." Later, while Kira napped, Grace helped Mabel grind dried herbs for a poultice. Holt sat at the table, stitching a tear in his saddlebag with the thread he'd come into Red Bluff to buy. The air smelled of peppermint and sage. "You ever think on what comes after?" Grace asked without looking up. "I think on it more than I admit," Holt said. "And I've got land east of the Laramie foothills. Not much. A cabin, a small corral, a stretch of earth I've been meaning to work right. Meant it to be for my brother and me, but plans change." Grace wiped her fingers on her apron. "What would you do with it now?" He met her eyes. "Build something that lasts." Mabel stepped out to tend her hens, leaving the door swinging open. The breeze curled through, lifting the edge of Grace's sleeve. "I used to think all I needed was to survive," she said. "But I want more. For her. For me." Her gaze flicked to the cot where Kira still slept, clutching the edge of the blanket in one small hand. "I want her to see gentleness last more than a moment." "There's room enough on my land for both of you," Holt said. "More than room." Grace crossed to the window and traced her finger along the sill. "They'll still be looking." "Then we stay ahead of them," Holt said. "And we don't look back." She turned toward him. "You sure about this? About us?" "I've never been more certain," he said. "You're not a burden to carry, Grace. You're the reason I keep walking." That night, under a moon that hung low and full, they left Mabel's cabin with a mule cart Holt had bartered for from a trapper who owed him a favor. Kira sat bundled between them, her doll cradled in her lap. Grace kept one hand on her daughter's back, the other resting lightly near Holt's on the reins. The road was narrow, rutted from spring melt, but they moved steady, eastward toward the ridge line Holt had spoken of. Past the river bend, the trail opened to a meadow lined with cottonwoods, their branches ghost white in the moonlight. "This is yours?" Grace asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Ours, if you want it." She stepped down first, lifting Kira into her arms. The girl yawned against her shoulder, already dozing again. Holt handed down the lantern and followed. The cabin sat quiet at the edge of the trees, built from rough-hewn logs, one window shuttered, the roof thick with moss and patches. Not grand, but standing. Grace walked to the porch and turned back toward him. "I want it," she said. "I want all of it." Holt came up beside her. Then let's make it home. Inside, the stove still held ash from the last fire. He lit a match and coaxed the flame to life, feeding it with pine kindling until warmth crept through the room. Grace set Kira down on the cot and covered her with a quilt Holt's mother had once sewn. When she turned back, Holt was watching her. I thought I'd lost the right to choose, she said. You didn't lose it, he said. It was stolen, but it's yours again. She stepped close. And you? What do you want? You, he said. Every day? As you are. Grace reached for his hand, threading her fingers through his. Then don't let go. I won't. They stood in the quiet, the fire crackling low, and outside, a coyote called from the ridge. Holt pulled her gently into his arms. She leaned into him, not as someone seeking shelter, but as a woman who had survived the storm and now chose peace. And he held her, not as a man rescuing, but as one who had found exactly where he belonged. The snowmelt trickled down from the ridge in silver threads, pooling in the shallow creek behind the cabin. By mid-April, the ground had softened enough for planting. Holt turned the soil with a rusted spade, sleeves rolled to the elbows of his worn wool shirt, while Grace knelt nearby with a basket of seed potatoes balanced on her lap. Her hands, once calloused from scrubbing floors, moved with steady rhythm, parting the dirt, tucking each piece in like it might bloom into more than food. Kira sat on a flat stone nearby, drawing shapes in the dust with a stick, her curls caught up in a red kerchief Grace had stitched from an old shirt sleeve. She hummed to herself, something low and tuneless, but sweet all the same. Won't be much of a crop this year, Holt said, pausing to wipe his brow. But it'll be enough. Grace looked up, her cheeks flushed from sun and effort. Enough's all I ever hoped for. He watched her a moment longer than he meant to, then bent back to the spade. That evening, after Kira had fallen asleep on the braided rug beside the hearth, Grace sat cross-legged on the cabin floor, patching a tear in her daughter's dress with thread the color of dry grass. Holt handed her a tin cup of boiled chicory and sat across from her. You ever think about what you'd be doing if none of this had happened? He asked. Grace didn't answer right away. She tied off the stitch, then set the dress aside. I used to imagine it, back when I still thought imagining made a difference. But now I'd rather think about what I can build with what's in front of me. She looked at him over the rim of her cup. That's new, Holt. He nodded. Thinking ahead used to be a kind of punishment. Now it feels like a promise. They were quiet a while, the fire popping low and steady. When Grace spoke again, her voice was softer. I never had a place where my name meant something more than a signature on a payroll ledger. Never thought I'd see a day where I got to choose what stayed and what didn't. You do now, Holt said. And you're not choosing alone. She nodded slowly. Kira's been sleeping through the night since we came here. I think her body knows what peace feels like, even if her mind doesn't yet. She's strong, just like her mother. Grace didn't look away. I've been strong because I had to be. I want to learn how to be steady because I want to be. You already are. Later that week, Holt rode down to the feed store in Laramie, nearly a day's ride west, to trade pelts and pick up a second-hand milk goat for Kira. Grace stayed behind, tending the garden rows and mending the roof drip with hand-twisted flax cord. When Holt returned, the girl ran to the fence, laughing at the bell around the goat's neck, her hands sticky with huckleberries. You've got a name for her? Holt asked, lifting Kira up so she could pet the animal's speckled nose. Whistle, Kira said, tugging his hat brim down low in delight. Grace leaned against the doorway, watching them. She doesn't speak around strangers. But she started saying more to us. She's opening like spring ground, Holt said, setting the girl down. Grace folded her arms. That's the first time I've heard you say something pretty without looking away after. He met her gaze. Maybe I'm done looking away. That night, when the cabin was dark save for the coals in the hearth, Grace sat at the edge of Holt's bedroll. Her voice was barely above breath. I want to stay, she said. You already are. I mean here. With you. Not just until it's safe. Not as a guest. He sat up, heart steady in his chest. You're not a guest, Grace. You're the reason this place feels like more than timber and stone. Her hand found his in the dark. Then let's stop tiptoeing around it. He reached for her, and she came willingly, curling against him with the ease of someone who'd finally found a place to rest. Outside, the wind rustled through the cottonwoods. Inside, There was no more running, no more hiding, only warmth, and the slow, sure rhythm of a life beginning. By early May, the days stretched longer, and the scent of pine warmed in the sun. Holt had started fencing the south pasture with cedar rails he cut himself, one blister at a time. Grace took to the cabin's side garden, coaxing cabbage and beets from the earth with quiet focus. Their lives moved slow, measured by work and the small rituals of trust unfolding between them. One morning, as Holt hammered a new crossbeam into place, a rider crested the ridge with dust rising behind. He straightened, wiping his hands on his trousers. Grace stepped out from the cabin, her eyes already narrowing. The man reined in near the well, leaning forward in the saddle. "Sutton," he called. "Name's Finch. From Cheyenne." Grace stiffened. Holt stepped forward, the hammer still in his hand. "Got word you bought feed from Danvers and Laramie," the man said, voice even. "He mentioned a woman and child with you. That's the talk in town now." Holt didn't blink. "What of it?" Finch dismounted slowly, one hand on the pommel. "I'm not here for trouble. I work with the circuit judge out of Rawlins." Livingston families dropped their accusation. Turns out the gold was never missing, just miscounted. Most likely covered their shame by laying blame where it couldn't talk back. Grace didn't move. "Why come all this way to say it?" Finch looked at her then. "Because I saw a woman dragged through the street in irons. And I didn't speak then. Should've. Maybe I'm trying to sleep easier now." Holt didn't relax. "You done?" "I am." Finch reached into his coat and pulled out a folded sheet. "Judge filed this to clear the record. Your name's clean, Miss Fallon." Grace didn't step forward to take it. Holt did, tucking it into his back pocket without looking. Finch nodded once, then turned back to his horse. As his figure disappeared over the ridge, Grace sank onto the porch step. Her hands were still, but her breath came sharp. "You're free now," Holt said quietly. She looked up at him. "I don't feel it." "You will." That evening, she stood by the barn while Holt brushed down the mare. The air smelled of sweet hay and warm wood. "I don't know what to do with peace," she said after a long silence, "when all I've ever known is how to brace for the next blow." "You don't have to know yet," Holt said. "You just have to stay." She leaned against the stall post. "When I was a girl, I used to watch my father stitch harness leather. Said you had to pull it tight, or it wouldn't hold. But if you pulled too hard, you'd tear it. I think about that now. Maybe that's what I've been doing, pulling too hard just to keep from falling apart." "You haven't torn," Holt said. "You've held. Only because you gave me room to breathe." He stepped toward her. "You don't owe me anything for that." "I know. That's why it matters." Later, inside the cabin, Kira sat on the floor tracing patterns with a pine needle in the dirt scattered from her shoes. Grace stood by the window, watching the sky streak pink and gold. She asked if Finch was a bad man, she said. "I told her not all men who come on horses bring harm. And not all men who stay are safe, either," Holt replied. "But I'm not going anywhere." She turned toward him. "I know." The next day, they took Kira to the stream that curled through the edge of their land. Grace pulled off her shoes and stepped into the water, laughing as the current tugged at her skirt. Kira squealed at the cold, then waded in beside her, clutching her mother's hand. Holt watched from the bank, knees drawn up, the sun glinting off his belt buckle. Grace looked over and met his eyes. "You ever think you'd end up with a woman who came in chains?" she asked. "I never thought I'd find someone whose strength made me want to be better," Holt said, rising. She held out her hand across the water. He took it. As the light faded, they sat together on the sun-warmed rocks, Kira asleep against her mother's side. Grace rested her head on Holt's shoulder. "I used to think love was something that had to hurt," she said, "that it had to be earned through suffering. And now," he asked, "now I think it's something that grows where it's safe to rest." Holt wrapped his arm around her. "Then we'll keep making that place. One day at a time." Grace closed her eyes, her hand laid gently over his heart. "I never thought I'd say this and mean it. But I'm home." He kissed the top of her head, slow and sure. "You always were." The rains came late that spring, slow and steady, soaking the earth in silence. Holt patched the north wall of the barn by lantern light, while Grace kept a kettle simmering with marrow bones and sliced onion. The smell filled the cabin, softer than anything store-bought, and Kira lay curled beside the stove with Whistle the goat asleep near her feet. By the time the clouds cleared, the stream that bordered their land had risen, painting the banks with green. Holt and Grace walked the fence line at dawn, boots sinking into soft mud, their hands brushing once and then staying linked. "Fence held," Holt said, tapping one of the posts with the toe of his boot. "Won't have to redo it come summer." Grace nodded, eyes on a hawk circling high. "I never imagined waking up without dread curled in my gut. It's strange, having room to stretch inside my own skin." He looked at her, quiet for a moment. "You're not just stretching, you're growing." "I didn't know that was still possible," she said. "Not for someone who's been cut down like I was." "You didn't stay down." He squeezed her hand. "And you never will again." Back at the cabin, Holt brought in 2 lengths of pine to plane down for a cradle. Kira had taken to sleeping with her legs flung across Grace's knees, and Grace laughed about it in the way that made Holt's chest ache. That evening, as he sanded the first board smooth near the fire, Grace stitched a line of calico squares together, her fingers nimble and sure. "I started sewing again because I wanted her to have something made by my hands," she said without looking up. "Now I think I keep going because it reminds me I can make beauty again, not just survive." "You've always had beauty in you," Holt said. "It's just got space to show itself now." She looked at him then, not with surprise, but with something settled and warm. "You've given me more than safety. You've given me back my name." "And you," Holt said, "you've given me a life I never knew to want." That night, after Kira had been tucked beneath her quilt and the fire had burned low, Grace eased into Holt's arms beside the hearth. Her cheek rested against his collarbone, and her breath came even and slow. "I want to marry you," she said, voice quiet but sure. "Not because I need a name, not because I need protection, but because I love you, and I want to build the rest of my life standing beside you." He didn't answer right away. He just held her tighter, his voice thick when he finally spoke. "Yes, Grace, yes." They wed under the cottonwoods 2 weeks later. Mabel came, bringing a loaf of sweet bread and a bottle of elderberry cordial. She brought wildflowers too, tucked in a blue kerchief, and tied them into a wreath for Grace's hair. Kira wore a dress with blue ribbon and held the ends of Grace's shawl as they stood before Holt. There were no vows read from paper, no preacher in black robes. Just hands clasped, eyes meeting, and words spoken true. "I will love you through the dry seasons and the floods," Grace said, steady as sunrise. "I will walk beside you, never ahead, never behind," Holt answered. They sealed it with a kiss that tasted of wind and warmth and hard-won joy. That summer, the ground yielded more than they'd dared hope. Beans thick on the vine, squash curling yellow and green. Holt worked the fields with a slow rhythm, and Grace took to writing letters in the evenings, sometimes to Mabel, sometimes just to herself. She read them aloud to Kira, who liked hearing her mother's voice shape soft things into stories. Holt built the cradle with carvings of birds in flight along the sides. Grace lined it with the same fabric she'd used for her wedding shawl. One quiet morning in late August, with the sun just warming the window pane, she laid a newborn boy into it. They named him Eli. Kira took to her brother like rain takes to dry earth. She sang to him in whispers, told him stories about goats and wildflowers, and how their mama could make cakes from scratch. Grace held them both in her arms, her body tired but whole, her eyes full. On the porch that evening, Holt rocked the cradle gently with one foot while Grace rested her head on his shoulder. The sun dipped behind the ridge, painting the sky in honey and ash. "I used to think I'd never stop running," Grace said. "Now I can't imagine being anywhere but here." "You won't have to run again," Holt said. "Not ever." She looked down at Eli, then over at Kira asleep with her knees tucked to her chest. "They'll never know fear the way we did. They'll grow up with love stitched into their days." "We made that," Holt said. "Together." They sat there until the stars came, until the night wrapped around their home like a wool blanket, until all the things they'd lost had softened into memory. And what remained, what always remained, was a quiet, unshakable joy built from soil, sweat, and the kind of love that never had to be spoken in grand words to be understood. They stayed, through the years, through seasons that passed like breath, Holt and Grace, side by side, with children who knew laughter and land that gave back what was sown in hope. And nothing ever took that from them again.